Hi there. Let's talk about Elizabeth Holmes and what kind of sentence she could possibly face. So I'm going to be showing you some charts. We're going to go through some calculations. Don't worry, it's simple math. I have my notes because it might get a little technical for me. I'll get challenged. So why don't you join me? Keep watching the video as we calculate her possible sentence could be. But let me just tell you, her sentence is not going to be a slap on the wrist. I mean, again, we don't know everything what other evidence they're going to present in the sentencing hearing that comes up in September, but it's not going to be a slap on the wrist. She will go to prison. How long? Let's do the calculation. But before I get to the calculation, let me give you some background so we all get on the same page here. So on January 3rd of this year, she was convicted by a jury of 4 counts of wire fraud, 4 felonies, each one carrying a maximum sentence of 20 years in jail, in prison, $250,000 fine, forfeiture of any assets that were the proceeds of the fraud, and likely victim restitution. So she was convicted of 1 count of conspiracy to defraud investors with her co-defendant, Sunny Balwani, and his trial is coming up. I think it's starting March 6th, and I'll be following that too. And 3 counts of wire fraud. And those 3 counts of wire fraud were defrauding 3 investors to the tune of $144 million that they invested in her blood testing technology, her blood testing company. And she was convicted of those 4 counts. The other 7 counts, some were not guilty regarding the patients, and some of the counts the jury was unable to come to a decision. So let's look at, and forgive me again for looking at my notes here. I can tell you this though, wire fraud sentences are no joke when you're looking at a maximum of 20 years. And I have no doubt this verdict to send a loud message to Silicon Valley and to all the CEOs out there. It's a wake-up call. You can't fake it till you make it. You can't defraud people. Wire fraud is no joke. So, how does the judge decide what her sentence is going to be? Now, it's up to the judge to decide. He has discretion. So what we have across the federal courts is we have what's called the federal sentencing guidelines, which kind of give a range of what the possible sentence could be. And the guidelines, do you remember sentencing used to be mandatory? In other words, the judge would just look down the chart and say, okay, that's your sentence. Well, as of 2005, the judges use those guidelines as advisory. In other words, they're not mandatory. And basically, the guidelines were set up so that the judges across all the federal courts in the United States could look to see, what were the other judges sentencing, defendants for similar crimes, because they wanted to keep it consistent sentencing across the federal court system. Okay, so I am going to, we're going to take a look at the sentencing guidelines. I'm going to pull up some graphs here. And just keep in mind there were 4 counts of wire fraud. The amount of loss is approximately $144 million. And so why don't you just join me, keep watching, and we'll take a look. I'm going to screen share here. We're going to look at some of these charts. So the first one I'm going to pull up here relates to the sentencing level, but let me back up a second here. I want to show you, these are documents, or don't I sound like a lawyer? These are pages from the federal sentencing guideline and her case involving fraud. So we look at this. So the base offense level. So this means this is where the judge starts. Anyone convicted of fraud, we started at 7. If their term is 20 years or more, and hers are, so we start at 7, and then we figure out whether or not she gets more than that or not. And then we're going to look at the sentencing table. This is just the background calculation. So now we look at the amount of loss. In other words, how much were the investors defrauded of? The jury found that she defrauded the investors of approximately $144 million. So not 6,500, not 15, not 40,000. So we got to keep going down. As you notice, you have to add. You will add to the 7. So we go down here to about 65 million to 150 million. She's right in between there. She's at 144. So you add 24 to that initial level of 7. So 7 plus 24 is 31. Okay, so we are going to go now to the sentencing table. Let's say, all right, what is a defendant at level 31? What kind of sentence could they be looking at? So let's take a look at the sentencing table. Okay, here's the sentencing table. I will scroll up here so you can see it all. I'll explain this to you. Fascinating stuff, don't you think? Anyway, I think it's good for us to know this about our legal system, all right? So here's the sentencing table. So she starts at 7. Here's 7 for if she was just convicted of 1 count of fraud, right? Just 1 count. She's in column number 1 because she has no criminal history that I'm aware of, although we'll find that out. So if she was just convicted of just 1 count, she got the minimum sentence and the judge applied these guidelines, that's 0 to 6 months. 0 to 6 months for 1 count. But because of the amount of loss, she's looking at substantially more time. Remember, we did the 7 plus the 24 is 31. So we need to go down the scale here to 31. And here's 31 right here. 108 months to 134 months. So if my calculations and my math are right, that's anywhere from 9 to 17 and a half years, because it's 9 years at 31. But I said 17 and a half because there's aggravating circumstances that the judge can consider that takes her down to a level of 35, which gives her a maximum of 210 months. So that's 108 to 210. So why did I go down to level 35? Well, let me give you a couple examples. One of the aggravating factors that Ms. Holmes may be facing is that her leadership role, she was the CEO. And according to these guidelines, the judge can add additional levels and take her down to, more than a level 31. And another aggravating factor is that it's called, what do they call it? Being responsible, hang on a second, let me double check. Sorry about this. Abusing her position of trust. And that would apply, arguably, to say that she was taking in money from investors, so she was holding the money in trust, right? And she defrauded them out of their money. So the judge could increase the sentence for that too. So that's how I came up with from 31 to 35, okay? Possibly being the maximum amount that she's looking at, anywhere from 108 to 210. Now, if she cooperates with the prosecution, say for instance, takes the witness stand in Balwani's case, right? He was the COO. He was the one that was in charge of, according to her testimony and some of the other witnesses, for overseeing the lab. And the lab was the one that produced the results for the patient tests, which is some of the counts that Balwani is facing. She could possibly provide helpful testimony for the prosecution. And because she's cooperating for the prosecution, she could get a reduced sentence. That's one thing she could do, is take the witness stand and help the prosecution prove their case. Here's another thing that she could do to reduce her potential sentence, is to take responsibility, show remorse. And, again, I watched her on the stand for 7 days. I didn't really see that. But, maybe that'll come up in the sentencing report. Or maybe if she takes the witness stand. She has opportunities to reduce her sentence, and I'm sure her counsel are looking into this. So if we go from 31 to level 35, that's where I came up with the 9 to 17 and a half years. Okay, so let me tell you some other information that I found out. So I looked to see, what has this judge done in the past regarding sentences for fraudsters? I'm sorry, I call them fraudsters. For people who've been convicted of fraud. What kind of sentences is this judge given? Okay, so I looked at several of these cases where he did sentencing. And again, I have to look at my notes here. And on average, the sentences were about 30% less than that range that we were looking at. So maybe Elizabeth Holmes gets 30% less of a sentence. So that would put her at anywhere from 6 to 12 years in prison. And then I also thought, okay, what is the maximum sentence that this judge recently has given somebody who's committed fraud? And again, she was convicted of multiple counts, plus a conspiracy count, which in the federal system, the judge could run these sentences consecutively. In other words, 20 years on each count if they wanted to do the maximum. But that's not what they really do, and that's not what the sentencing guidelines doesn't do consecutive sentences. It does incrementally increasing the sentence. And that, again, is up to the discretion of the judge. In other words, the judge could add 6 months for additional count. The judge could add an additional year. Or the judge, it's up to the judge. It's their discretion. And yes, she has the right to appeal her sentence. And I'll talk about that in a second. So anyway, my best guess, and I'm sure you've been waiting for this, is that somewhere in the range of 8 years. No kidding. Because I also looked at what this judge, he takes fraud cases very seriously. So on average across the federal courts, back in 2020, on one count of wire fraud, the average sentence across the federal courts was 21 months. This judge, his average sentence is approximately 30 months. Okay? The other thing is that I've been asked a lot of questions about reporters. Or I should say not about reporters, from reporters. Sorry about that. The question is, will she get, the question reporters have asked me, will she get home detention and not go to prison? I don't think so. I don't think that's likely at all. And why? Because if this judge follows the sentencing guidelines, and it looks like he does, yes, he makes modifications. But if he follows that guideline, anybody who goes above 10 months, being the maximum of a sentence, and in her case, she's well beyond 10 months. They aren't entitled to get home detention. So that means prison time. Is she entitled to get a mix of prison and detention? Also, I don't think that's likely. Although, I'm not the judge, and it's up to the judge and what he decides what's appropriate. So another question a reporter has asked me, well, she's a new mother. Does that matter? Well, technically it doesn't. It's not one of those mitigating factors or aggravating factors, but again, it's up to the judge and his discretion to decide. I think she has a 1 year or two, well, I think it's a 1-year-old baby. That's tough. But again, it's up to the judge to decide. Another question a reporter has asked me is, can the judge give more than 20 years? Can they do the consecutive sentencing? Judge could, but it's not likely. Again, in the federal system and according to these sentencing guidelines, it's really an incremental increase, not a consecutive, right? And the other question is, can she appeal her sentence? Yes, like every defendant, she can appeal. It could potentially be one of the grounds for her appeal, because I'm sure she's going to appeal, as every defendant should, her convictions to make sure that those convictions stand. Okay? So assuming she loses on appeal, then she will be sentenced, right? Then she will serve her sentence. She will be sentenced in September. And what is the standard for the appeal of the sentence? Well, the higher court would have to find that this trial judge imposed a sentence that was not reasonable in light of the evidence. I don't think that's going to happen with this judge. Okay, keep in mind, there are many moving parts yet to be determined. What's the recommendation from the probation department? What is her defense going to argue? They're definitely going to be arguing to reduce her exposure and to get the least amount of time in prison, right? And we don't know. There might be other things going on. We also don't know if there's going to be helpful information, helpful evidence that comes out in the Balwani case that helps Elizabeth Holmes or implicates Elizabeth Holmes or shows that she had less responsibility or more responsibility. We don't know. That's why that's why she's going to be sentenced after Balwani's case. We also don't know what the prosecution, what the U.S. attorneys are going to recommend to the judge. We don't know what evidence they have. Again, it's all moving parts, yet to be determined. And this calculation was just an exercise so I could show you the federal sentencing guidelines, show you how somebody might calculate Elizabeth Holmes' possible sentence. And again, it's just my opinion. My math could be wrong. So how much time do you think she could get? How much time do you think she could get in prison? So why don't you leave your answers below? I'd love to read them. Please like and subscribe. I want to keep providing legal analysis to you, and please support my work and my analysis. So thank you very much for watching.